The following podcast is non-profit and is based on the IGCSE history curriculum. Hello listeners, this episode is about the Iran-Iraq War and why it lasted for so long. Firstly, what factors had caused tension in the Middle East? One of the factors was oil, basically control over oil supplies and exports. Firstly, Iraq and Iran both wanted control of an important waterway called the Shatt al-Arab Waterway, as it gave access to the Persian Gulf and would help to increase oil exports. Although they had an agreement to share the waterway under the Algiers Agreement of 1975, Saddam wanted control of the whole waterway. Secondly, Saddam saw an opportunity to seize Iranian oil fields in Khuzestan, a region in the southeast of Iran. This region accounted for around 60% of Iran's oil reserves. Controlling this oil would have made Iraq wealthy and powerful. Another factor was leaders. This included conflict and rivalries between the leaders of countries. Firstly, Saddam Hussein had tried to improve relations with Iran after the revolution. However, Khomeini rejected these attempts. Instead, he called on Iraq Shiites to overthrow Saddam, who Khomeini called an atheist. Secondly, Iraqi Shiites had tried to assassinate Saddam and other Ba'ath Party leaders. Saddam believed that the Ayatollah Khomeini was behind these plots because he wanted to spread the Islamic Revolution to Iraq. Thirdly, Khomeini had become increasingly popular in the Arab world after the turning of Iran into an Islamic state. As Saddam wanted to be seen as the leader of the Arab world, he saw the war as an opportunity to reduce Khomeini's power and influence in the region. This was also a factor of nationalism. A third factor was religion, one prime example being conflict between Sunni and Shia Muslims. This is because Shia Muslims were often discriminated against in Iraq, as Saddam's Ba'ath Party were mostly Sunni Muslims. As most people in Iran were Shia Muslims, this caused tension between the two countries. The final factor was nationalism, a desire for increased territory and influence in the region. Firstly, Iraq had one of the largest armed forces in the Gulf. After the revolution, Khomeini had purged the Iranian army of any officers that were loyal to the Shah and had ended a military alliance with the USA. Therefore, Saddam believed that the Iranian armed forces were weak, thinking that he could win a quick war against them, increase Iraqi territory, and become the dominant power in the Gulf region. Secondly, after the revolution, an Islamic regime was set up in Iran. The US embassy hostage crisis that followed led to many Western countries imposing sanctions on Iran. Therefore, Saddam believed that Iran was economically weak, and he thought that he could win a quick war against them, increase Iraqi territory, and become the dominant power of the region of the Gulf. Thirdly, as mentioned in the leaders factor, Khomeini had become increasingly popular in the Arab world after the turning of Iran into an Islamic state. As Saddam wanted to be seen as the true leader of the Arab world, he saw the war as an opportunity to reduce Khomeini's power and influence in the region. Secondly, we will move into how dangerous the Iran-Iraq War was for stability in the Gulf. The Iran-Iraq War lasted 8 years and cost the lives of millions of soldiers and civilians. Neither side made significant territorial gains, yet the war had serious repercussions for the Gulf region and international peace. We're going to look at the positives and negatives for both Iran and Iraq. In terms of positives for Iraq, firstly, Iran had hoped the Iraqi Shia Muslims would rise up against Saddam during the war. This never happened. It showed that Iraqi Shiites were largely loyal to Saddam. Secondly, during the war, the Iraqi army was expanded. Iraq was also sold weapons by the West, China, and the USSR. This meant that by the end of the war, Iraq had the world's fourth largest army. Thirdly, countries such as Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Kuwait provided Iraq with money and routes to export their oil during the war. This showed that Saddam had significant support from many Arab countries in the region. On to the negatives for Iraq. Firstly, The cost of the war and falling oil prices crippled the Iraqi economy, leading to the Iraqi government cutting back on their spending on education, healthcare, and welfare for the Iraqi people. Secondly, the war ended in a stalemate, and Saddam failed to achieve any of his war aims. He failed to gain any Iranian territory and the control of the Shatt al-Arab waterway or Iranian oil fields in Kurdistan. Thirdly, Iraq suffered huge casualties. It is estimated that between 350,000 and 500,000 Iraqis died during the war. Many of these civilian casualties were killed by Iranian missiles during the War of the Cities. Finally, the war led to increased opposition to Saddam in Iraq. Mass protests and attempts by the Kurds to gain their independence led to brutal suppression. Mass arrests and the use of chemical weapons against Iraqi Kurds shocked many international observers. Now, in terms of positives for Iran, firstly, countries such as Syria and Libya provided Iran with financial and military aid during the war. This showed that the Islamic government in Iran had some support from some Arab countries in the region. Secondly, many Iranians supported the war against Iraq and even volunteered to fight in the jihad, which means holy war, against Saddam. This showed that the Islamic Revolution in Iran had wide support. On to the negatives for Iran. Firstly, Iran suffered huge casualties. It is estimated that up to 1 million Iranians died during the war. Many of these civilian casualties were killed by Iraqi missiles and chemical weapons during the War of the Cities. Secondly, the cost of the war and falling oil prices crippled the Iranian economy. This led to the Iranian government cutting back on their spending on education, healthcare, and welfare. Thirdly, Iraq had hoped that Iranian Sunni Muslims would rise up against Khomeini during the war. This never happened, and showed that Iranian Sunnis were largely loyal to Khomeini. And finally, the war ended in a stalemate, and Khomeini failed to overthrow Saddam and spread the Islamic Revolution to Iraq or other countries in the Gulf. So, overall, who benefited more from the war? Well, one could say that Iraq benefited more. Firstly, during the war, the Iraqi army was expanded. Iraq was also sold weapons by the West, China, and the USSR. This meant that by the end of the war, Iraq had the world's fourth largest army, making Iraq more secure and safe from attack, and increasing support for Saddam as he was keeping the people safe. Secondly, countries such as Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Kuwait provided Iraq with money and routes to export their oil during the war. This showed that Saddam had significant support from many Arab countries in the region. If they were invaded by Iran, they could use these countries as their allies for support in the conflict. Others could say Iran benefited more. Firstly, many Iranians supported the war against Iraq and even volunteered to fight in the jihad against Saddam. This showed that the Islamic Revolution in Iran had wide support, so if Iraq invaded again, there would still be people to fight and resist the invasion. Secondly, countries such as Syria and Libya provided Iran with financial and military aid during the war. This showed that the Islamic government in Iran had some support from Arab countries in the region. This showed that Iran would have allies and help if Iraq invaded again. Meanwhile, you could also say that neither side benefited. Firstly, the war ended in a stalemate. Neither side achieved their goals, while many soldiers and civilians were killed in the conflict. Secondly, the cost of the war and falling oil prices crippled both economies, leading to the governments to cut back on their spending on education, healthcare, and welfare for the people. This could have resulted in less support from the people, and as there were many casualties, there were not many soldiers to defend the countries. Thirdly, how serious a threat was the Iran-Iraq war to stability in the Gulf? On the one hand, it was a serious threat to stability in the Gulf. Firstly, if Iran had won the war, they would have controlled most of the world's oil reserves. This terrified the USA and other Western powers who were reliant on oil from the Gulf. They may have taken military action against Iran if they had won the war. Secondly, during the war, Arab states in the Gulf either supported Iran or Iraq. leading to divisions and increasing tensions between the Arab countries of the Middle East. Thirdly, new weapons of mass destruction, such as Scud missiles and chemical weapons, were used in the war. These weapons had the power to cause huge devastation. This concerned both Arab leaders and the wider international community. Finally, Iraq built up a huge army and developed new weapons during the war. This led to it becoming one of the strongest military powers in the Gulf. Saddam began to threaten other Arab neighbors like Kuwait, which caused increasing tensions in the Gulf. On the other hand, it wasn't such a serious threat to stability in the Gulf. Firstly, and quite importantly, the war ended in a stalemate. This meant that the balance of power in the Gulf remained intact between Iran and its supporters, and Iraq and its supporters. Secondly, the Iran-Iraq war was focused mainly around the Persian Gulf. This meant that the devastation that it had caused was contained to that region. Finally, for this episode, how important was Western involvement to the outcome of the Iran-Iraq War of 1980 to 1988? On the one hand, Western involvement was important. The US provided intelligence to Iraq about Iran's movements, so they knew what attacks were planned and were able to defend themselves effectively. They also provided weapons and sent battleships to the Persian Gulf, so the Iraqi army was able to become much stronger than the Iranian army. On the other hand, Western involvement was not so important, or was not as important as other factors. Firstly, there were many other countries in the Middle East which got involved. Supporting Iraq, Saudi Arabia provided $40 billion of subsidy, and other Middle Eastern countries helped them to export resources, for example oil. Syria and Libya, on the other hand, provided help and support to Iran. Secondly, military tactics were very important factors to the war ending in a stalemate. While Iraq used their air force to bomb Iran, Iran was able to safely store their air force to attack Iraq later on. Also, fierce fighting in the towns made more time for volunteer soldiers to arrive. Furthermore, Iran attacked in waves, while Iraq built trenches and defended themselves. Very little progress was made. This is the end of the podcast. Thank you for listening. Please consider using the links in the description below to leave a voice message for me, leave feedback for me, or visit my website which hosts additional revision material. Depending on which app you are listening to this on, you could also rate and review the podcast. Thank you.